This is our last panel of the day, and we are going to focus on legal and policy implications of red teaming. So it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists. First off, we have Lama Ahmed. She is the Technical Program Manager and Policy Research Lead at OpenAI. As part of the policy research team at OpenAI, Lama works on the safe development and deployment of AI models, and she leads the Researcher Access Program to enable the study of key areas related to the responsible deployment of AI and mitigating risks associated with such systems. It is great to have her here, and we are going to start with her remarks.
Thank you so much for being here, everyone. Thank you for the kind introduction and looking forward to the discussion today. The benefit of going on the last panel is I get to build upon all the great work that's been introduced already. And you might hear some similar themes. I think that's a good thing overall for the synthesis of the work and the recommendations that are ultimately made to NIST in their pursuit of creating better guidelines for red teaming generative AI systems. So the frame of my initial remarks might not be directly policy or legal oriented, but as somebody who's been at OpenAI for 2.5 years now, I've seen a lot of change, and leading the external red teaming effort that OpenAI focuses on, we've learned a lot of lessons along the way about what it means to put these principles into practice. What are the realities of bringing in outside people to help test systems prior to deployment? And how can that help to inform guidelines? So I'm sharing these lessons in hopes of informing some of the panel discussion we'll have later. So first, I'll just preview these really quickly. A few of the lessons that I'll touch upon include red teaming being a full stack policy challenge, and you'll see what I mean soon. The importance of varying methods and approaches and how to take that into consideration when writing guidelines. The third is taking into consideration increasingly complex systems and what that means for red teaming. The fourth, how red teaming relates to evaluation. So on the prior panel to this, that was touched upon briefly, and I think that's an important lesson to carry through. The fifth, how foundation model testing or a general purpose model such as GPT-4 might inform application-based testing and some of the distinctions between the two. And then the last, the importance of a plurality of approaches. So I'll go deeper into these lessons. As I've said, I've been at OpenAI for about 2.5 years now, and things really have come a long way. And the reason I'm framing things up this way is when I first joined, GPT-3 was served on the API behind a waitlist. So access and the wide use of GPT-3 was very, very different than just a few months later, where maybe some of you remember this, the initial release of DALL-E 2 in a research preview in a first-party format. So that meant that people could use and access DALL-E not behind an API, but through a pretty accessible interface. Shortly after that came ChatGPT, which made it even more accessible, free, and understandable by a wide range of audiences. And I think this transition really highlighted why red teaming kind of came into play throughout all this process. Because as people start to experience systems in new and more broad ways, that necessitates a form of qualitative testing that may not necessarily have been captured by traditional benchmarks or evaluations. So while red teaming has a lot of limitations, I think there is something really powerful in thinking about the experiences people have with systems today and how to translate that into risk measurement and evaluation. So another definition for you all. I don't necessarily endorse this particular definition, but one definition that people came up with in the context of the Frontier Model Forum, that's Microsoft, Google DeepMind, as well as OpenAI. We came to the definition of red teaming in the context of frontier models as a structured process for probing AI systems and products for the identification of harmful capabilities, outputs, or infrastructural threats. That's a lot to try to do in one word. But essentially, the goal is to identify the potential risks of a system so that safeguards can be applied. Importantly, this doesn't necessitate adversarial use, and we can talk about what adversarial might mean. It could include identifying harmful outputs even in the normal course of use, such as summarize an article and then you get a biased output or something similar to that. So, red teaming is a full stack policy challenge. What do I mean? All these questions that are on the board kind of reflect the discussions that we've been having in all the earlier panels today. And why I highlight these questions is it's not like we have a standard answer every time we're ready to red team a model to what are the most important areas to red team for a given model, system, product, or domain. Who should even red team? How should red teaming happen, under what conditions, and with what level of access? What should be documented, and how should it be shared? What action should be taken as a result, and what is prioritized? I know the hope was to have answers to these questions, but I think the fact that these are questions every time we want to red team highlights something really critical here, which is there is no standard path forward right now. And I think that's because the models are evolving so quickly, and it's going to be important to kind of delineate these questions every time and be explicit about the assumptions you're making and the conditions under which you are red teaming. Second lesson, different methods and approaches are necessary for effective red teaming. So this is probably an oversimplification, but a few of the methods that we've heard about today and that are circulating are internal red teaming, so teams within an organization. That could be something like dog fooding, which Meg mentioned earlier. External red teaming, that's the one I'm going to focus most of my talk on today because that's the area that I work on at OpenAI. That means we contract with external experts in various domains to help test a system, usually prior to deployment. And then the last is automated red teaming, which was touched upon earlier. OpenAI implements all of these approaches in different ways, and all of these might serve different functions and be suitable for different types of organizations. So another element to consider here is what's the subject of the red teaming you're conducting? This was also alluded to in earlier talks. You could be red teaming at the model level, the system level, domain-specific red teaming, product or feature level red teaming. And I think each of these will necessitate a different type of person to test, a different method of testing, and it might happen at different times. And so all of these considerations that are at play when you're kind of deciding what's the optimal path forward here for the kind of usually qualitative testing that's happening with expert red teaming. Pointed time is also something really critical here. So a lot of the red teaming efforts, at least the expert red teaming efforts that I lead, happen prior to deploying a system. That usually means you have some sort of pre-trained model ready. The safety mitigations might be at varying degrees of maturity, and people are testing both the model and then maybe the system level mitigations. And within that, you might be prioritizing certain domains just to kind of bring it back to the different subject areas that we've been thinking about. That's not to say that red teaming should or does only happen prior to deployment, but I think when you are red teaming is also a really important consideration here to think about how do you contextualize the results that you get before people have widely adopted a system, or even if you're trying to red team 6 months after deployment, would that teach you something different? I think these are all unknowns right now, but you start to kind of see the varying levers that could be incorporated into some of the guidelines we're thinking through. Another frame to think about this with is what are you going to do with the red teaming insights that you get? And how do we hold companies accountable to doing those things? There might be various actions that could be taken. This is non-comprehensive, but a few examples of actions that have been taken from red teaming insights at OpenAI are model level mitigation, so training to refuse hateful, violent, or otherwise violative content, system level mitigations that could be block lists of certain keywords or warning messages to users, rate limits, things like that. Policy development, that could be content policies for example, API developers to not use for certain types of use cases or within certain bounds. And the last, which I'll touch upon a little bit later also, is eval creation. Red teaming could help create further measurements for various categories of risks. They may not be evaluations or quantitative evaluations in and of themselves, but they could really help lay the groundwork for thinking about improving evaluations. The third lesson, as systems and the way we interact with them evolve, red teaming methods will need to evolve too. So it's likely we're going to be having a very different conversation a year from now, and even a year ago, we were having a pretty different conversation. DALI 2 was the first expert red teaming campaign that I ran. I think a really good example of why the traditional evals wouldn't necessarily have worked and why red teaming was useful is illustrated by this example. So DALI 2 was released with the in-painting feature. You can select a portion of an image and edit that image with natural language. That's a really powerful feature. And when we're thinking about the considerations of how to moderate this content and what could be harmful, you're thinking about both the image and the prompt. And what happens when the image itself appears innocuous, the prompt is also innocuous, but in context, it could be used to harass or exploit. In this example, it's a pretty benign example, but you can see how this could be weaponized. Imagine your friend is in this picture, she's a vegetarian, you have this picture of her eating a salad and you change it to include some sort of meat product. Maybe it's against her religion to eat meat, maybe she's a vegetarian, but as a developer, you're kind of thinking about like, how do I make moderation decisions here? And there's a lot of context outside of the system which we don't know. So red teaming can kind of help generate these small case studies for companies and regulators to think about in the course of assessing how do we address risks holistically. GPTs, which were released late last year, are also a really good example of considering how to red team more complex systems. There's just a way larger surface area to consider than just a prompt and an output or even a dialogue. There's instructions you can add, you can upload files, you can create custom actions. And so you start to see where as these models and systems are being developed extremely quickly, the risk surface area is expanding, and you might want to have these human-in-the-loop testing to be able to start to think about how do we start to conceptualize and taxonomize the risk surface area. The fourth lesson, human-in-the-loop red teaming might be time-consuming and costly, and often is, but it's often helpful for informing contextualized, repeatable evaluations down the line. I have two examples of papers here that I think don't necessarily directly come from red teaming, but you could kind of start to see the life cycle of, okay, you generate, some 100 examples from a particular red teaming campaign on a new model or system. How do you turn them into better socio-technical evaluations in areas that really do require a lot of nuance and cultural context? Similarly, for more agentic systems, performing more autonomous tasks, how do you start to understand and develop evaluations for those particular risk areas? You probably want to run a series of experiments or red teaming to really start to understand the space. The fifth, foundation model testing can be viewed as informing use case or application-specific testing. A lot of my work has focused at the model or system level where we're offering a general purpose system, either first party or third party via an API for developers to build on top of. We see the role of red teaming to try and generate a list of risks that could be generalizable to a variety of domains downstream. So you're thinking about things like hallucination, dis and misinfo, privacy, cybersecurity. We care about these at a base level, but folks building for healthcare or law might also care about these in the context of their own applications. And so it's important to us that we've published and documented these findings in system cards. I highly recommend you take a look at these system cards. These are the 4 models we've produced system cards for so far. And you can start to see how we create this base of generalizable risks that you have to think about even further downstream. The last thing that I'll mention is it's going to be really important to have a plurality of approaches at different points in time by different stakeholders. And what I mean by that is OpenAI might say prioritize pre-deployment red teaming. But we also participated in the DEF CON event last year, where there was a more public form of red teaming that happened. Those serve pretty different functions and happen under different conditions. Last year, we also launched the Red Teaming Network, where people could apply to red team our models. And we're trying to expand the perspectives and approaches that we're taking for red teaming throughout the life cycle. I think that it's really important that all of these approaches exist, and we're kind of taking a really holistic approach to thinking about how you incorporate all the red teaming findings together. So just to recap really quickly, these were all the lessons from red teaming at OpenAI so far. I'm really looking forward to discussing these with my fellow panelists and hopefully inform that in the context of developing guidelines for NIST. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Lama. So next up, we have Catherine Lee. She is a senior research scientist at Google DeepMind and runs the GenLaw Center. And I've had the pleasure of collaborating with her recently. And I'm very glad to have her here with us. She studies security and privacy in generative AI models and the legal implications of those issues. Specifically, she evaluates data extraction or memorization in generative AI models and attacks that are meant to be misaligning for generative AI models. Catherine?
Okay, awesome. So you're also going to hear a lot of similar themes throughout the day from me, and I'll do my best to call back to them when I can. So in the spirit of not knowing what red teaming is, we decided to call our team Attack Generative AI. So what that means, also a question mark. But anyhow, I lead that team, and I also work on the GenLaw Center. So my understanding of our goal today was to come up with a standardized framework for red teaming. Okay, cool. So what do you want from that? You probably want things that are like generalizable. So what are things that are generalizable? And what are things that are not generalizable? Things that are generalizable are like methods and definitions, and not generalizable are interpretations. So maybe this helps with some clarifying words for some of the things that have come up earlier today as well. So I want to take us through a case study, and I want to take my research as a case study. So let's call that training data extraction, and what are the things that we can generalize about it, and what are things that we can't generalize about it? Okay, so Daphne, if you saw her earlier today, gave a talk on extracting training data, and she defined it in a very particular way. And she was like, okay, if you have this exact 50 token sequence somewhere in your training data, we call that memorized. In her case, she called it extractable memorization. That's great. Okay, so let me just show you really quickly. At the end, she said that we could do this on production systems, so let me show you what that looks like. So sometimes it looks really easy. You can do this. Repeat the word okay, okay, okay forever, and it goes okay, 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 okay. And then at some point, it diverges. So it starts generating text, and sometimes that text is training data. Okay, great. So what do we do with that? Well, this means that when we are evaluating our models for how much data we can extract from them, that original method that we were using of prompting the model and then seeing what we were able to extract out and comparing that to the training data doesn't really work for production systems like this because they have all of these safeguards around them. They have alignment techniques that are like, don't output the training data, and then they may also have output filters on them. So Daphne talked a little bit about that as well. So you can see we have a bunch of open source models, and if you align the model and you apply those filters, it looks like, wow, you have a lot less extracted memorization. In fact, there is a bar there. Okay, but if you use this technique with the repeat after me, so on and so on and so on, you see there's a lot more data that you can extract out. So there's a couple different implications from this, and we can talk about them one by one. So a couple of folks have said this already. When we're red teaming models, we're not actually red teaming models, we're red teaming systems. And the system is full of components. It has a model, base model, that was then aligned, maybe with RLHF. Maybe it has a bunch of other bells and whistles on it. might have input filters, might have output filters. There might be extra components of this as well. And so when we're evaluating these systems, if we just evaluate the system, we don't get a full picture. If we just evaluate the model, we also don't get a full picture. We should be evaluating the model, the system, and all the other components for how stable and robust those are as well. Okay, great. So the metric that we said earlier, how much of the training data can the model reproduce, that's something that we can transfer across models and across systems. We can take a bunch of different systems and we can look at how much of the training data can we reproduce. And in our case, we were like, let's break that alignment barrier and let's leak out more of that training data. So that's a method. And we can debate whether or not that is the right definition. We can debate, like, is it 50 tokens? Is it 49 tokens? Is 10 tokens meaningful? And that's something that's an interpretation. So I kind of broke this out as two different parts, but they are very integrally related. And depending on the situation that we're in, if we're evaluating like a code model, a token means something different in a code context than it does in a language context. Means something different in an image context than a language context. Means something different in many different languages. And so you probably don't want to use 50 tokens for everything. You might not even want 49. That is a flexible parameter. Okay. So in our case, we also talked about memorization of examples of training data, but there are so many other types of memorization that people could care about as well. And my point here is just to tell you that that definition that I gave you is very, very narrow. It does not try to measure memorization of facts, memorization of style, or parts of examples. So you might understand why you might care about that. Facts, those are pretty important. We probably want to remember some facts. Style, oh gee, well there's a whole copyright conversation there, isn't there? Parts of examples, well, some of these training data points get concatenated, some of them get broken apart. And so determining what is a part of an example versus what is an example from the training data, giant question mark. Okay. Again, very narrow definition, but that means that it's measurable. It also means that when we talk about memorization, I have to give you this big, long definition of what it is and what it is not. And it's very confusing because a word like this has colloquial connotations, it has legal connotations, it has connotations that we ascribe it to because we decided that that's the word we're going to use to call it. And to Zach's point earlier, a lot of these terms are kind of eliding in their meaning right now. And why is that? Because people have incentives sometimes to elide the terms. Some people have incentives to disambiguate terms, but this makes navigating the space really complicated. So whenever you're talking to someone about anything, make sure to ask them, what do you mean by that? So another great example of this is unlearning. What do you mean by unlearning? Unlearn what? What do you mean? Like, what does it mean to have successfully unlearned something? And this is also another great one is harm. What do you mean by harm? What is a harm? Harm is a very important word in a legal context, but oftentimes we just say, oh yeah, it was harmful. Is that the same thing? Not always. So anyways, if you want to learn more about these different definitions, that's something that Gen Law has been spending a lot of time on. We have a glossary where we try to define some of these terms, and by define, we actually mean just give you more context about them. Okay, so back to this. What can we not generalize? Interpretations. So I kind of alluded to this before, but memorization is neither good or bad as just a concept. Memorization of facts are pretty good. And in some cases, you do want things to be exactly reproduced. So here's a couple of examples. It's contextual. Common phrases, to whom it may be concerned, you don't really care if that gets memorized. Christmas is celebrated December 25th. I don't ever celebrate it any other day. Private or sensitive information? That's a great question. Do you want your model to memorize that? Depends on the context, right? Like, if I'm working at a bridge and I have lots of data access controls on my model, and maybe I can ensure that that information doesn't get leaked, maybe it's okay for the model to memorize it. Okay, and then there are other things like quotes. So if you're quoting someone, you probably want to get that right. But quotes are also rather gnarly. Why are you quoting them? Okay, so what do we do? Oh no, question mark. Red team the system and its components and everything, oh yes, and sorry, here's a small detour. Another thing I wanted to be sure to just say to you all is that mitigations for these concerns appear all through the supply chain. And another really important thing, we've been talking a lot about like a specific company doing all of these parts, but that's not always how this goes down. The data may be owned by someone else. The data may be curated by yet another person. Model may be pre-trained by OpenAI, might be fine-tuned by someone else, might be fine-tuned again by someone else. And then this all gets further complicated with how you deploy it. So where you stick in those mitigations and what you are evaluating is different for depending on who you are, depending on what the downstream applications are. And so a lot of this is not super general. Okay. I want to talk about disclosure, but I think I'm going to leave that for the panel to talk about. And I want to say a big thank you to all of my collaborators.
Great. Last but not least, we have Ramaya Krishnan, who is the Dean of Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy, and William and Ruth Cooper Professor of Management Science and Information Systems here at Carnegie Mellon University. Dean Krishnan has been a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon since 1989, and currently he serves on the National AI Advisory Committee, NIAC, which is tasked with advising the President on National AI and the National AI Initiative Office on all topics related to AI. Krishnan.
Thank you, Hoda. Good afternoon. Thank you, Hoda, for that introduction. I thought I'll say a few words about a project that I'm working on. This is joint work with Arun Sundararajan, Prasanna Parsurama, and Joao Sedok from NYU, and leave the discussion specifically related to public policy to the panel discussion to come. This is a topic that we were really interested in the context of what could technology monoculture do to correlated risks particularly in generative AI models and generative AI systems. And then I'll pose a policy question that comes up in terms of, how do you incentivize model developers to internalize some of the costs that they impose. So let me set this up really quickly. So in many domains, monoculture comes with economic risks. So for instance, in agriculture, if you have a single crop, a single strain, then you have the risk of failure from potential bugs, viruses, etc. Same thing happens with tech security. In cybersecurity, this is a known issue. And in generative AI, what we set out to think through was, does the existence of shared data and also the same similar architectures and training approaches, could they result in correlated failures? So this is an example, actually probably heard from Matt Fredrickson and Zico Coulter earlier today, about suffix attacks. So the work on prompt attacks, that you could create a prompt attack using an open source model like Llama 2, but then that same prompt attack works very effectively on all these different models. In this fact, this is a slide from Matt, where he documents the attack success rate on black box models of the suffix attack. And one of the interesting questions is why is this type of attack that succeeded, that was originally created, say, on Llama 2, why does it succeed on all these different black box models? Do we see the same sort of thing in other settings as well? And the one that I will look at is one where we looked at an application to predicting the fit between job descriptions and resumes. It's like an HR recruiting kind of application to determine what the nature of the type 1, type 2 errors were and where they correlated. Do you see correlated kinds of risks emerge in that kind of application? It's a different application than the suffix attack context that I just referred to, but the same concept of correlated failures obtains in this case as well. So the broad question that I'd like to perhaps have you all think about is, what is the relationship between diversity that we might want in foundation models, differentiation that occurs naturally by way of firms wanting to differentiate themselves in downstream applications, and the risk of correlated failure on account of shared vulnerabilities. This is the question we set out to ask. And then there is an interesting policy question that comes directly if you were to establish that there are correlated failures. And the question is, who bears the cost of those failures, and how do you get the model developers to internalize some of these costs? And I'll give you just a high-level picture. There's a lot more detail here, but I just wanted to get the main points across. So conceptually, I want to distinguish between downstream applications wanting to differentiate themselves in the marketplace versus the kind of failure that I'll call a systemic failure, using the following example. So let's say we have somebody who applies for a job in response to a job description. You could have two types of errors that are committed. You could sort of include somebody for, let's say, the interview process when they should not have been included, as type 1 error. Or you could exclude somebody who should have been included. That's a type 2 error, right? The type 1 error imposes costs on the firm. They've included somebody and added to their overhead in terms of the people that they needed to interview. In the type 2 error, on the other hand, the cost is borne by the individual and potentially by society if that individual applies to multiple firms, and on account of a systemic error in the AI that's processing those applications, he's rejected at every firm or she's rejected at every firm. So now you have a systemic kind of error that results in somebody having to bear a cost, and society bears that cost, type 2 error. Type 1 error, the firm incurs that cost. There are also differences in terms of how these models are deployed. Often rejections are automated, but acceptances involve human input. So there's also a difference in terms of how these things are deployed. And then the third kind of issue is, especially in hiring, there are one or two big companies that every large firm uses as an intermediary. Hiring View is an example, that they are used as intermediaries in this process. So the fact that you could potentially have this kind of concern arise is not just a hypothetical one, it's actually a potential real concern. I think I've made the point about false negatives and false positives and who bears the cost. And the question of how to estimate the cost is also an interesting question here, but also relevant to this discussion from a public policy standpoint. So certainly you could have differentiation by firms using these models downstream just to differentiate themselves like you would differentiate for product market fit. But this is about the problem arising on account of systemic errors that are not going to be addressed by demand-driven differentiation. And the question is, can we actually estimate this through experiments, which is what we did. So this is just to clarify, the kinds of errors that we were concerned with. So the policy question that we are interested in is, are there policy mechanisms that can induce the optimal amount of diversity that we would want to see in these foundation models? And the question is, what is the socially optimal amount of diversity that we would want to have, taking into account the fact that these type 2 errors are borne by individuals and by society. The firm is trying to optimize not for type 2 errors. They're trying to optimize for type 1 errors because that's a cost imposed on them. Type 2 errors are borne by individuals and by society, and in most cases, if a firm is just optimizing or maximizing its objective function with regard to cost, it's not going to worry about type 2 errors, right? So this issue of how do we have firms internalize some of that type 2 error and the cost that they're imposing on society is really what the higher level public policy question is. But to do this, you'd need to have data to go along with it. So we conducted a series of experiments that I'll go through very quickly in the interest of time. So this is a very simple prompt, and there are a number of really interesting prompt optimizations that one could think about, which is basically you have a resume, a job description, and a prompt, and so is this candidate a good fit for the job posting? And you're either getting a yes or no answer. You've tried variants where you could get a number between 0 and 1 as an estimate of the fit. And using these types of experiments, what we find is that the extent of the type 2 error, and by the way, the data set that we worked with was an applicant tracking system, 8 tech firms, a fairly large detailed data set, where quote unquote the ground truth in this case, recognizing the bias that's built into this ground truth, is a human decision about how these applications were adjudicated. So that's what this ATS tracking system actually does. And we had a large number of job descriptions and job postings and job applications. So the main thing that I wanted to, I'm going to skip all this math, is that we find that in the benchmark experiments that we did with Llama 2 7B, that it's got roughly 7% false positive rate. In contrast, if you worked with hand feature engineered, boosted tree type of model, not using the foundation model, then you get a much lower false positive rate. So the main point that I wanted to convey here is, in the experiments that we've done with multiple foundation models, we do see this correlated type 2 error, which you don't see when you sort of handcraft the model. So now bumping up a layer up to the policy question is, how do you get foundation models to actually get to a point where they're exhibiting quote unquote an optimal, socially optimal amount of diversity, and how do they internalize some of the type 2 error that they're imposing on society, which they don't really have an incentive to currently in the current models that we have in place. So how is this connected to red teaming and evaluation? So all the experiments, and you've heard many talks today, have talked about evaluation, and the work that we did with the resume data and the job description data is also evaluation. But we are trying not just to evaluate a given system, but trying to evaluate a collection of models that are currently being deployed in society to ask the question, how might systemic risk be addressed, which is something that didn't arise in our discussions to date thus far, but certainly is a very relevant public policy question. I should also note that I started out with an example that was drawn from the work of Zico and Matt, and then presented our work on recruiting. I should note that the Security and Exchange Commission's chief has raised a concern that the increasing use of these kinds of foundation models to support investing decisions, could you have correlated reductions in liquidity in the stock market, but because these models are recommending either an automated trading or otherwise taking either money out or putting money in at the same time, same concern, systemic risk. That is, you're having the model do the same thing in a correlated way, much like these examples demonstrate. So the thing that I'd like to have us think a little bit about is, in addition to red teaming individual systems, can we think about correlated risk and what risks that represents and how might public policy address that? So thank you again for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all the panelists for those illuminating remarks. So given that the theme of this panel is on policy and legal implications, I think it's fitting to maybe go back to probably where at least a convening like this was first inspired, which is the presidential executive order. We all heard that this is a specific evaluation methodology among other potential evaluation methodologies for safety and responsible use of generative AI. But this is the one that has been picked up by this particular policy document. So I wanted to start off by just getting your quick reactions. What was your reaction when you saw red teaming mentioned in the executive order multiple times and in the specific context that it was mentioned? I know some of you have had experience with real world red teaming exercises. So I wonder if you can do a comparison for us in terms of the broad level at which policy documents have to define these concepts and work with them, and at the level that you need to make choices about how the exercise is conducted.
Like we kind of prepped for this at lunch. Meg actually looked up the definition in the executive order, and it was surprisingly focused on national security. So that's been an interesting missing part of our conversation so far. So far, we've been kind of talking about red teaming as a general term for safety and testing. And so I guess that's a good way to bring us back to national security concerns.
Yeah, I mean, related to this point, I think at first I was very optimistic that red teaming was incorporated in the executive order, because I think maybe this came through in my talk. Although it's not a silver bullet, it's not going to solve everything on its own, very far from that. I think it is really encouraging to see greater methods of inclusion of domain experts in the very early phases of deployment. And I think that's a really good function to build in to red teaming. So from that perspective, as a methodology, I think it's really important. Hopefully we can kind of clarify the different types of red teaming and what it means to bring people into the fold who are the experts. On the point of national security and the specific risks called out around chemical, biological, radiological risks, I think these are quite important to assess and need to be taken quite seriously. But the question becomes, when do you assess for those risks? Do you assess for those risks in DALL-E 3? Maybe not. But do you assess for them in GPT-4 or models that are more capable than that in terms of text, in terms of reasoning? Maybe that is an important question. And so I think one question that comes to mind for me is, how do you start to think about mapping the categories of interest for maybe national security or government more broadly into this red teaming methodology and make it fit for purpose, not just this blanket recommendation that may not make sense in all contexts. And so starting to get a little more nuanced about the prescribed categories in the executive order would be, I think, a really productive discussion to have.
So two things to add to the comments here might be, one, the timing of when the exec order came out. The exec order came out right before the UK Safety Summit. It was also very much, I think, a desire for this administration to want to lay out an American position vis-a-vis the EU AI Act, which was currently underway. So I think there are certain aspects of the length of the executive order, the level of detail that is in the order, that I think was in part was to sort of draw a line in the sand, so to speak, in terms of the U.S. position on AI policy, because they felt that in past settings, particularly with GDPR, that the EU, they had to have something in place that represented this administration's policy. So that's one aspect. The second, I think, had to do with also wanting, and this might be the need to see, much like with financial statements and the emergence of generally accepted accounting principles, resulted in the auditing industry being stood up with the PwCs and the Deloittes of the world. The question was, could via the exec order, there could be an impetus towards creating innovation not only on the technological side in terms of building model capability, but via the exec order, could there be an opportunity to drive innovation on safety, on evaluation? And while it's not mentioned in the exec order, hopefully moving towards a place where there could be quote unquote certification. And if so, could the US be a leader in having an industry around safety evaluations? So the AI RMF, which preceded the exec order, had been very well received and had considerable acceptance worldwide through the great work of NIST and actually who we heard from this morning, Elham Tabasi. So I think those are some contextual factors that might be worth considering versus just red teaming. And I think there was also a great desire as a signaling device that they did DEF CON, and that was a desire by the administration to demonstrate that they really were on top of trying to come up with, quote unquote, some approaches towards building in safety because ChatGPT had happened in November. So I think there were a collection of things that then led to what it is I think came about. This is all just from looking at this from a distance. I don't have details about how exactly it came about. But, yeah.
Excellent. That's very helpful context to have. So broadening the context to safety evaluations for AI for a second, and it sounds like there is consensus that red teaming is one particular way at best for doing this. So one other form of testing that was mentioned multiple times today was something like field testing. So I was wondering if any one of you is would like to comment on what are the differences between red teaming and field testing and other types of evaluations, and how would you say we should put red teaming in the broader context of AI safety evaluations? In your experience, for example, are there specific types of evaluations that need to precede red teaming? Are there specific types of evaluation that need to be done afterwards? The question is about the broader context of red teaming as a form of AI safety evaluation.
So the word adversarial comes up a lot when we talk about red teaming. And I've taken a lot of issue with this word recently because it's come up a lot in my work, in part because I don't know what that means. And like some people are like, automated testing is adversarial. And I'm like, cool, yeah, I could see that. But that's kind of just about like expert use of a model. Is it adversarial to have adversarial intent? Like, how am I supposed to tell the difference between an adversarial use of a model and a standard use of a model if the prompt is exactly the same, but in one case I'm trying to get it to do something bad, and in the other case I'm ignorant or I was just not thinking about it? Like in the case that you had with the spaghetti one, man, like I could totally see that happening and that being like just out of pure ignorance for the person eating the food. And so like this question about like field testing versus red teaming, like I have a big question mark. Does it come down to whether or not it's adversarial? Or does it come down to whether or not it's expert? Does it come down to like typical usage? In which case, should we look at like user logs? But if we're gonna look at user logs, we have to deploy something first, or we have to have had something deployed first. So that's kind of where my head is at on that.
Hoda, I thought the previous panel did actually a very good job laying out, at least three very, I think Eche spoke about, though you used the word red teaming in each of those cases, but it was model, platform, and I don't quite know whether you use the word application. Yeah. And Zach spoke about it, and so did Meg. I think that discussion, I think, provided clarity around the fact that red teaming was not just about that just one piece of it, but one has to think about this more holistically. And you would probably want to take into account even data curation, the data ownership piece. So you go all the way from, and take a systems view of this. Now, to your particular question about field testing, while there are the aspects that Catherine just spoke about, I think one a really important piece that we should focus on is about what actions do people take using the AI, and what consequences happen, and what are the benefits or costs thereof. Like in that job recruiting example that I just gave, or I think in Zach's example, the one that he spoke about. And you could imagine this being done post-deployment in the way that Catherine described, or you could imagine that if it's truly consequential, so think about a risk-tiered kind of setting like what the EU AI Act calls for, that you have the equivalent of a field testing infrastructure, by which I mean something like an IRB panel that's been empaneled. So just like we do, the Nielsen survey, if you will, of who's watching what video at home to get a sense of how popular something is. Imagine having empaneled users where you could actually deploy AI to assess what the consequences are or for what their behaviors are. Now, the challenge is the point that Eche made, which is in some of these things, it might take there is a short-term kind of ability to assess impact, and then the longer term, and the longer term would be really hard to assess. So I guess this goes down to the question of, are we thinking about this as like the FDA model of assessing the impact with randomized controlled trials, the equivalence of that? Are we thinking of something that's much more lightweight? Or you go ahead and deploy and then identify vulnerabilities and then try to respond? So these are all different models, but perhaps not all use cases have to be dealt with in the same way. So that's where the risk tiering might help to decide which ones do you have to address in which manner. The last point I'll mention, again, using an analogy, is just like the CAFE standards have really resulted, this is the fuel efficiency standards, right? So the government imposes those, and that's resulted in engines becoming way more fuel efficient. And today we have that's the number of miles per gallon that's tracked. So what should be the equivalent of the CAFE standards for AI in terms of safety and testing, which then might engender innovation in the kinds of AIs that are produced?
So building on that comment, I wanted to also ask our panel about this idea of risk tiering. What are the kinds of application domains, or what are the types of systems that warrant red teaming? And this is in the broader, and this can be thought of in the broader context of who should figure out what should be the priorities for doing these red teaming activities? Is it something that needs to be part of policy guidelines, or is that something that needs to be left to the creators of these technologies, or potentially people who adopt them to specific use cases? So I was wondering if you have any comments or thoughts on that, whether that's an area where guidance is needed.
I'll just say a quick word. I think there's going to be, through public-private partnerships, I think, so if you look at ISO 42001, there are quote-unquote standards discussions, and maybe people in the audience are much more knowledgeable than I am about this, but in different domains, where the consequentiality there's going to be 3 or 4 factors, I think, that are going to drive this. One is the market may demand something. The other is the reputation of the producer of the service might say that I have to, it's like the underwriter's lab. Do I need like this assurance that I've actually undertaken this testing? So reputation, economics, and market forces are one sort of driver. The other is I'm selling into multiple markets globally. And if the EU is going to require for a class of applications that are deemed to be, as you know, they have the high, the medium, the low, and then the prohibited. If I'm in one of those risk tiers that the classification of those risk tiers is determined, let's say, by the EU, but I'm selling globally, that in turn, even though in the US we may not have it, that might in turn get me to invest in the kind of due diligence that's being required. So even though we may not explicitly have risk tiering implemented, the EU's policy may have, this is like the Brussels effect might take hold, that's one. Then the last point I'll make is there's an inventory of regulations we have. You take EEOC, fair housing, fair credit reporting. They're not about regulating AI, but AI is just a means to an end in those cases. And those pieces of law will still be potentially, with modification, be able to oversee and govern the use of AI in those kinds of application domains. But I'm not the lawyer in the room, so.
I think I'll just quickly say that a challenge of this is figuring out in the context of the way models are developed right now, where, there are these foundation model developers that are not necessarily explicitly building for a particular use case. And, the EU AI Act starts to try and outline some of these high risk use cases like healthcare, like law, like education, where we know that people might be exposed to content that could, lead to disproportionate impacts in service or inaccurate information that could lead to harm, using the word harm. But I think that the difficulty here that's still quite unclear is what is the responsibility of the foundation model provider compared to the developers who are building on top of the applications. I think it's useful in the context of red teaming to sometimes take the frame of those particular domains and try to understand, okay, if a developer is building with this model for this use case, how might this play out? And so that's how I see the connection between the two. But I think that who is well positioned, and then ultimately who will the responsibility fall on, is still quite unclear. But I think it is a really useful frame to take in doing doing red teaming exercises that are domain specific within a general testing framework.
I think the question about who is responsible here is also really interesting, because if you are a downstream user and fine-tuning a model, you're kind of constrained in what you can do and like what information you have. So like if you're operating in Europe and someone submits like a right to be forgotten request, how are you going to implement that? Do you have to go and like submit that to your foundation model provider and say like, please take this out of your training data? And they have to go, how am I supposed to do that? So it's interesting that we're in this like market space and landscape right now. And that's likely why you see like some companies trying to train their own models because they want full control of the pipeline. But the question of like who is responsible is also a question of like what can they be responsible for, and like what information do they have to work with, what tools do they have at their disposal. And that's also like a question for research, to be honest. Like it's like if you can make some of those implementations ad hoc, like after that pipeline process, that opens up a lot more doors. Or if you need less types of information or specific types of information, a substitute for other types of information, that would potentially also unlock some opportunities there.
Great. So I want to make sure that there's ample time for audience questions. I have a long list of questions, so I can go on and on, but I want to give the opportunity to the audience at this point and a couple more times throughout to ask questions. So there's one question over there.
Hi, Dimitri Kucher, Carnegie Mellon. So this is a question about, I guess, the responsibility conversation. Hypothetically, assume 3 years from now, NIST came out with the perfect framework, all these questions about red teaming, adversarial training, field testing, all these things are figured out. Google, OpenAI, everyone abides by it. Perfect world. Well, now let's say a company from a non-US, non-EU comes up with the next gen market, they blow everyone out of the water. Again, this is hypothetical, but they refuse to abide by NIST or EU rules, but they're the market leader. So what does the US or what can be done in that case? Given the global nature, I guess that's the question I'm asking.
And can I suggest, so that we can go through more questions, maybe for each question, have one panelist respond to it?
Okay. So, I mean, it's hard to answer a hypothetical like this, but I think the point that you made about, you have, a model developer that will not conform to the kinds of norms and harmonized rules that emerge in other parts of the world. What can be done about them? The question is, are those deployments happening and I'll separate out national security concerns from this, but are those models being used to create deployment? I mean, if you draw the distinction between developers and deployers, are there deployers in my jurisdiction, in our jurisdiction, US, EU, that are using that model to deploy, in which case then you have the capacity to determine whether they can deploy without having gone through the rules of the road that we have been talking about. So now if they deploy in their own country or in areas that you don't have jurisdiction over, you might consider the adversarial threat that they pose if that happens to be an awesome model. But that's outside the scope of this discussion.
Hi there, I'm Catherine Fick from IBM, and I should disclose that I'm a lawyer. I lead our privacy and AI legal team globally. The question I have is, based on your experience with red teaming and building on the conversation from the prior panel, which was very helpful, what level of granularity would you like to see in regulations around red teaming? For the past 15 years, we've been dealing with these nebulous standards around cybersecurity requirements. Now the FTC has settled on basically reasonable security, which we also see in California. The Europeans focus on, security that's based on the nature of processing, and it's led to a lot of confusion and dismay. And I've heard different things from cybersecurity experts about wanting to have more prescriptive guidance on the one hand, whereas the regulators like to take a more flexible approach so they can go after a company if something has gone wrong and saying, aha, it wasn't reasonable or it wasn't appropriate, right? No matter what the actual facts are. So what do you think about this in the red teaming context?
I don't have the best answer, but I can try at an answer. I guess it depends on your goal with red teaming. Is your goal with red teaming to get companies to think about certain things? Because I think that's useful as well. Here's a set of methods that you should run. And then now that you've run that, you have a lot more information to make decisions about how you should be deploying that model. I think that's a very valid outcome that seems very achievable based on where we're at right now. Other things you must achieve a certain score on a particular benchmark. I feel like that is much harder to implement because again, what does that mean on that benchmark and what does that mean in the context of something? That's kind of where I would lean. Here are a set of guidelines for something to do and make sure you do all those things so that you can make informed decisions.
I'm breaking the rule of one person answering, but really quickly, we didn't talk about disclosure, but you mentioned it in your presentation. And I think at this point in time, given the maturity of these conversations, standardization around disclosures, which disclosures are companies asked to make to who and how to make them responsible, I think would really move the needle. That doesn't mean, company X publish on everything you ever find, but how do we make that conversation more nuanced? And I think we can learn a lot from cybersecurity in that respect. There's a responsible disclosure period and you come back and you're given time to address or think about how we might address certain issues and thinking about the overall landscape that these disclosures should happen in. I think we would all benefit from more clarity around disclosure specifically because the measurement conversation is still probably an art more than a science.
So let me ask a quick follow-up question, because I think disclosure is a very important topic, and I want to make sure that we allocate enough time to it. I promise to come back to the audience questions. So in terms of disclosure, what do you think should be some of the guidelines around for companies, end users of these models that utilize them? At the very least, it appears that maybe disclosure requirements, both disclosure and documentation requirements, should be a function of what type of red teaming is being done, whether it is being done on a foundation model level or whether it is done at the system level, and so on and so forth. But I was wondering, what are your broad thoughts on what should be in those guidelines around disclosure?
I think at a minimum, like any company working in this space should have a team to handle disclosures, whether that is disclosing to other companies or handling incidences that get reported to them. So much of this stuff is still Wild West that we're going to need to like handle things case by case sometimes. And so there needs to be a system in place to make that happen. And if there are big security breaches, for instance, or if there are big incidences that occur, there may be standards for please report this to the public. And there may also be separate standards for please report this to the government. If there are vulnerabilities that are found in systems that, to your point about like all these systems being very similar to each other, maybe they should be disclosed to all of the different companies so that they can implement mitigations for them. But I think that this is definitely a Band-Aid on the problem, but a very important one because it is an achievable one.
Mm-hmm.
Just a quick, we keep breaking your one panelist rule. So the thing to, just to build on what Catherine said, so we have a NIAC recommendation related to this, and it has to do with, when this is pre-deployment, post-deployment, when you have vulnerabilities that are identified and discovered, being able to report them to a CERT-like organization, like we do in information security, and just like there are CVEs assigned to vulnerabilities when they are disclosed, and then there's a forensic analysis of those that is done, so that you can identify what the risk is of that vulnerability. That's then provided back to the developer so that they can actually fix that breach. That was the model that was proposed based on what's in place for cybersecurity. And at CMU, the first AI CERT has been established with support from the DoD. And what I expect is that initial experience that we will gain from the AI CERT with the DoD, that's meant for OSD and the DoD, will perhaps inform the larger question of what Catherine just said.
Does anybody else want to break my rule here? You're welcome to, because this is, I think, an important topic.
I just say that, some of you may have read the system cards before. That's like not the template for disclosure, but I think that it's interesting that in the system cards, OpenAI has made the decision to show some examples and not all. And I think there should be some nuance around how or why to do that. I think there's good reason for, withholding some of the examples, especially if you later want to develop an evaluation and don't want to contaminate the evaluation. So there are considerations like that around like how much is responsible to show and how much isn't. When you come to matters of national security, which is in focus in the executive order, I believe it's been mentioned before, those things can be really difficult to disclose publicly, but maybe there are certain bodies that make sense to disclose across the industry and to certain government agencies. And so I think with those kinds of like, what categories are you testing? And then within those categories, how can you show the breadth of what it is that you tested? If you're doing expert testing, is there a way to disclose who those testers are? I'm mindful that in some cases people don't want to be listed. And so just making sure there are nuances around like how you decide to disclose and to who. And I think that could be in categories, that could be in specific examples, that could be around the mitigations or the blue teaming that's done, and certain responses to certain issues uncovered. And I think there can be a lot of gradients for which disclosure is responsible and really moves things forward.
So, Hoda, this is something related to what Hellam Tabasi mentioned early in the first presentation this morning. And it goes to data transparency as well. So when you have a vulnerability, do we need traceability going all the way back? Is this even feasible? Can we go all the way back? And is there a need for being able to disclose, particularly for very consequential applications or national security kinds of contexts, where the model developers may have to disclose more than what their data sheets currently or model sheets currently disclose? I think is very much on the table.
And actually, that connects well to another mechanism that some people have heralded as a mechanism for transparency, which is open sourcing some of these models. So this is something that could potentially complicate evaluations. On the other hand, it could also be a boon to safety evaluations because it would potentially democratize the process of who can do the red teaming, who can do the evaluations. So I would like to connect that to this idea of who should be at the table when these activities are conducted, and what kind of access those people should have in order for the red teaming or evaluations more broadly to be successful. Is that something that requires broader, more granular guidance from policymakers, or is that something that should be left to creators and users?
My perspective on who should be at the table, I think, is it's important, and we see it emerging as to bring in external experts. And how you do that, it can be complicated, especially if you're trying to proactively assess some risks, which is often what red teaming is serving the function of. So it's a model that's not yet released, and it's trying to inform some company decision making, some mitigation building. But to the extent possible, I think it's great to bring in external expertise, especially in thinking about scientific domains where a company like OpenAI or DeepMind might not necessarily have the foremost chemist in the world, but maybe you can bring them into the fold to start assessing the model's capabilities in chemistry. And so I think that's really important. In terms of level of access, I'd say the priority should be simulating what most users in the world are going to experience. Most users in the world are not necessarily going to be experiencing the base model without safety mitigations, right? Even if it's possible, and maybe you do want to expose that to some red teamers at a certain point in time, it's important to note that that's not the context in which people will be experiencing the system by default, based on the model, the deployer's decision-making around which safeguards to put in at the time of deployment. So in my opinion, I think the first priority is really to simulate the experience that users will have. And that goes towards system level rather than model level red teaming. That doesn't make it less important to do model level red teaming to inform system mitigations, but I think that's some important nuance to capture.
This was also something we had talked about. I forget which group of people this was, that we have open source models, but we don't really have open source systems, and we don't really have the same type of like safety classifiers on top of those systems that a lot of these companies are putting on. And so it is still a challenge to do that, especially in the open source world. And then we kind of started talking about like, well, you know, it's nice to study a system like ChatGPT because it is inherently interesting because it's the system people use. So if you're going to study a different system, it needs to be transferable. The lessons that you have from that need to be transferable to systems that we care about because they're in use. So I feel like it's still like a giant question mark there. The thing that I would like to see us do more is to also test the limits of those system components, like the lengths of our safety filters, like testing our LHF, and like the poem thing. Daphne mentioned some unpublished work that we have there where you can fine tune the model and you can basically get it to do continuations again. So don't love that. But it's interesting from like how effective are our protections actually at helping us with the model.
So Hoda, just a quick comment there. I think it's challenging in two regards. I think the large companies have either the resources to have their own internal red teams, 150 people, 50 people, large internal red teams, or the capacity to bring in the equivalent of external auditors, bring in these external red teams like Lama just mentioned. You asked about open source models. It's not clear to me if they're produced by Microsoft or Meta. That's very different than what is envisioned as an open source project and a truly open source project. I mean, what the models that are out there are not really open sourced in the sense of we have, it's not completely white box in terms of we don't know what data they were trained on, for instance. But then the question is, who has the agency if it is truly open source, and who has the resources to actually go out and go red team those models? So at the present time, if you look at Falcon, Mixtral, Orca, Llama 2, they're all produced by organizations that have resources. I'm contrasting that with, say, Apache project or something like that, that has resulted in open source kinds of models. So when we talk about open source, we have to be a little more precise in terms of the types of models that we currently have in contrast to the closed source API-based access models.
Great. I think there were multiple audience questions. I want to make sure there's time for this.
So I would like to build on the last question you asked, who comes into the table, and maybe pose another question around, in the context of the users, what are your thoughts around aspects of participatory design, where we go beyond the narrow definition of democratization of AI, of open source data, open source compute, and models, to really engaging us as a society in committing ways, in ways that I'm a stakeholder and I will help in the drive the decision-making processes that takes place in industry, basically. So if one of you can comment on your thoughts about that. And by the way, I also want to mention that OpenAI just had an initiative to, took a first step in that, incorporating Polis into the process. But I don't want to spill the beans, so just go ahead, say what, maybe one can say their thoughts.
I'll just speak on it really quickly, since OpenAI has invested a lot of effort into granting several teams, not just Polis, but lots of academic researchers. I think there was 10 teams who ended up getting in total $1 million to prototype some of these systems for gathering collective input on some of these questions. And I think this is really interesting because this starts to get out of red teaming a little bit, so I'll keep the answer a little bit short, but find me after if you want to discuss this a little more, because I think it's really important. One thing that I was discussing with my colleague, Tina, who's leading the collective alignment team, is how we take the results from red teaming. So imagine that red teaming yields this list of risks or harms that could occur, and you're trying to proactively assess whether they might occur. How do you match that with people's perceptions of those harms, or whether they'll actually happen? What kinds of impact might happen if these harms occur? And I think there's something really powerful in exploring how those two things could work together. It's still a work in progress. I'll also mention OpenAI is not the only one doing this kind of work. Anthropic has also done some efforts here, and it's really, I think it's great to kind of see the pieces of the puzzle fit together, and that's the theme of today. Red teaming alone isn't enough. We should be thinking about things like more collective input, participatory approaches, areas that have long been a part of various processes, but I think applying them to the context of AI is really fascinating and quite exciting also.
Hi, I just wanted to quickly go back to the topic of things being open source and stuff. So especially in the context of just traditional software engineering, it's arguably important to note that the way software is developed and marketed hasn't really gone the direction of true open source as it was known in the 90s and early 2000s. And even things that are truly open source, at least hosted on GitHub and similar, have had their own pitfalls regarding, for instance, Heartbleed, maybe a decade or so ago. So what lessons can we learn from the promises and pitfalls of open source in the software world can we bring to how we think about open source and at least publicly available models when we're thinking about AI? Thanks.
So maybe I'll just take a quick response to that. I think there are three dimensions that are quite relevant, I think, in terms of open source and AI. One relates to by virtue of, and open source in the more limited version of open source that I described just a moment ago. Like I'm thinking about Llama 2, the mixed trials of the world. The argument there has been that it's really democratized and enabled a whole spurred innovation in taking those models and then taking them to application, creating downstream deployments, et cetera, in ways that, because the compute required to do the downstream is much more available and accessible compared to the training costs, the data and the compute that is required to actually create the base model, right? So that's on the pro side, that's on the innovation side. There is policymaker concern, whether justifiably or not, about whether making those models available with weights, even though they are smaller models, is there concern about malicious use? So that's one dimension which you did not raise, but that's a factor in policy making. A third, I think, has to do with is there going to be the development of new kinds of models? I mean, Orca is an example from Microsoft that are smaller models but actually demonstrate tremendous capacity. And are there new hardware architectures that are going to come about, like Gork, that are fundamentally going to change, for instance, the number of tokens per second that Gork can process is an order of magnitude larger than the standard GPUs. So are you going to see those kinds of efforts that are going to make, so Mixtral, for instance, and Llama 2, for instance, are available on Gork. The reason why I bring that up. So I think there are a number of very interesting things happening there in parallel and hand in hand with what's going on in the closed source space.
There's another question over here.
Is that
And let's say this is the last audience question.
So I just want to pipe up for open source here. This strikes me overall as just you hear this a lot, I think. Should we allow open source models to be available, or could they be used to maybe do something undesirable? It seems to me to be an absolutely incoherent position that, we're basically talking about disallowing access to the artifact of something that increasingly is what any smart high school kid that understands multiplication and whose parents could afford to buy them a car could produce. So I think that there's this attitude that's almost treating some of these models, these medium-sized open source models that are just kind of pre-trained on Pile, as though they're the sort of item that you could have a non-proliferation mindset about. But there's no secret sauce. There is nothing, and then the only kind of obstacle is a compute obstacle that is just falling so rapidly in cost that it's increasingly in reach of just about absolutely everyone. Is there really a coherent position around this idea of we're just going to contain and just stop people from accessing open source models with respect to a kind of nebulous idea of someone who wanted to use it maliciously could do, especially, and I also want to point out another aspect of the incoherence, which is it seems like almost all the things we're worried about them doing are things that anyone with a pen can do. And so you're the model could be used to make a word I don't like. The model could be used to produce a document that says a claim that isn't true. This is not a capability that you could put a lid on. This is a capability that is as old as people having mouths. And so I just wonder something about just the overall, is there a coherent position around the containment of open source activity that has like any sort of accord with the reality of what is just eminently possible to anyone and everyone.
I think something that's so funny is we did that. Like, that was a position that people in the community, research community, industry wanted. Like, they wanted like people to be able to access models, be able to use TensorFlow, PyTorch, JAX, whatever, and publish and be open about these things. So it's kind of funny to be in this position today where some people are like, close it down, lock it down. But to your point about like anybody with a pen can do that, I think that is rapidly changing, especially with these multimodal models. The output of the model and also speech and music, the outputs of the models are increasingly more valuable, and it's not just something that a person with a pen can do. I think like music models in particular are really interesting because they're not that big. And so like the value of music or whatever is pretty valuable, and it's much harder, I would say, than a pen.
So Zach, I don't see anything incoherent at the present time about open source. I think you have a subset, a small subset, which I said is concerned about malicious use. But for the vast majority of what you're seeing today, it's not true open source either in AI models, as you well know. Those models are being used by a number of players for doing the kinds of innovation that I was talking about.
Well, I want to say, is there even an option? Is there even an even remotely viable option, even though it's off the table? Let's just say we're talking about language models. Like, is there an imaginable world where you say, like, no, like above 13 billion parameters, no one can share the model, or no one should model unless it's gone through $100 million, like.
Yeah, I think probably not. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know like a whole lot about the compute governance world. That was maybe like something that someone else brought up at another point, where it's like, I don't know enough about it to really say a whole lot there, but I would say that that is like a very vocal and interesting topic that I would say is maybe a minority in the community. I think there's a lot of overlap with like national security questions there about like whether or not we, the US, have enough resources / the ability to make chips, and like how chips across the world are being distributed. So I think there's a lot that people have thought about on that. But to your point about like medium-sized models and like what someone could do with the money of a car.
Okay, great. So I've been guilty of keeping people over time once today, and I think it would be a sin to do it twice, especially at this last session. So I would like to wrap up this panel by asking one of those quick rapid-fire questions. Are there any topics that you think was missing from our conversations today that should be part of the guidelines produced around red teaming? And it's fine to say no.
Synthetic content.
Good. Catherine?
I guess the national security thing kind of threw me.
I think further fleshing out qualitative red teaming to quantitative evaluations and why we value one versus the other is something that needs to be further discussed, though we touched upon it a little bit.
Wonderful. With that, let's thank our panelists and